The order was transmitted at 4:11 in the morning Iranian Standard Time. Not by radio, not by satellite uplink, by a fiber optic landline buried 6 meters below the desert floor of Khuzestan province, a hardened communications cable installed 18 months earlier by Chinese telecommunications engineers whose presence in Iran had been logged by Western intelligence as routine infrastructure work and filed fatally under the category of civilian Belt and Road activity. The order was 4 characters long in encrypted Farsi. Translated, it meant one thing: activate. In the next 90 seconds, across 7 dispersed airfields stretching from Tabriz in the northwest to Avaz in the southwest, ground crews who had been standing at their stations for 11 hours received the same signal, simultaneously. Maintenance locks were removed. Autonomous navigation systems completed their final self-diagnostic cycles. Turbofan engines, small, efficient, nearly silent at ground idle, began their startup sequences. And 2,000 CH-7 stealth unmanned combat aerial vehicles, each one a flying wing of composite radar-absorbent material, carrying a precision strike payload that could level a city block with 5-meter accuracy, began rolling toward their runway thresholds in coordinated sequence from 7 airfields, simultaneously, in darkness. The first aircraft was airborne at 4:13 a.m. By 4:17 a.m., the Israeli Air Force's northern radar network detected an anomaly. Not a contact, not a track, but a statistical ghost. A fluctuation in the background noise floor of the radar returned that the system's algorithms flagged at confidence level 23% and routed to a human supervisor for assessment. The supervisor, a lieutenant colonel with 16 years of experience reading radar displays, looked at the screen for 4 seconds. He picked up his phone. He called his commanding general. He said, "Sir, I think they launched." The general said, "How many?" The lieutenant colonel looked at his screen again. The anomaly had resolved slightly. The confidence level had climbed to 31%. The direction of origin was unmistakable. The number of individual signatures, faint, fragmentary, on the absolute edge of detection, was still climbing as more aircraft crossed the Iranian border into Iraqi airspace. He said, "Sir, all of them." In the next 4 minutes, every alarm in Israel's National Air Defense Network began to sound at once. The Prime Minister was woken. The IDF Chief of Staff was already in his command center. The American ambassador's emergency phone rang at 4:19 a.m. Tel Aviv time, which was 9:19 p.m. the previous evening in Washington, and the duty officer in the White House Situation Room reading the flash message that came across the secure terminal 40 seconds later reached for the phone to wake the National Security Advisor with hands that were not entirely steady. 2,000 CH-7s were in the air, heading west, flying at 14,000 meters altitude, nearly invisible to every radar system between them and Tel Aviv. Israel had approximately 31 minutes. What you are about to hear is the most operationally detailed, analytically rigorous account of what the activation of Iran's CH-7 fleet means for Israel, for the United States, and for the entire architecture of security that has governed the Middle East for 30 years. Today on the Jiang Report, we are going to cover 5 critical dimensions of this moment. First, the operational mechanics of the CH-7 activation, how 2,000 stealth drones were launched simultaneously from dispersed Iranian airfields, how they were routed to evade the limited detection capability of existing radar networks, and what their target packages reveal about the strategic ambition of Iran's military planners. Second, the weapons and technology reality. Why the CH-7's combination of stealth range, payload, and autonomous targeting capability creates a threat that Israel's layered air defense architecture cannot absorb, and why the mathematics of this engagement are catastrophically one-sided. Third, Israel's response in real time. What the IDF attempted in the 31 minutes between detection and impact. What worked, what failed, and what the outcome reveals about the fundamental inadequacy of defensive systems designed for a threat environment that no longer exists. Fourth, the American alert. What Washington knew when it knew it, what it was able to do, and what the gap between American capability and American response reveals about the limits of the world's most powerful military in this new strategic environment. And fifth, what this activation means for the regional order going forward, and whether the world that existed before 4:11 AM Iranian Standard Time can ever be reassembled. This is the Jiang Report. Stay with me. If this channel has ever given you something that changed how you see the world, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with every person in your life who is still operating on the assumption that the Middle East security architecture is intact and that deterrence is holding. It is not holding. It has not held. And the analysis you're about to hear will explain precisely why, with the kind of technical and strategic depth that the news cycle cannot provide, and that official government communications are specifically designed to obscure. Subscribe, share, stay with me. The operational plan for the CH-7 activation, designated internally by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Air and Space Force, as Operation Eternal Dawn, had been in preparation for 14 months. It was not conceived as a reactive strike, a response to a specific Israeli provocation, or a proportionate escalation in an ongoing exchange cycle. It was conceived as a campaign opening strike, the first move in a military operation designed to eliminate Israel's air defense infrastructure as a functional system within a single operational window, creating the conditions for follow-on strikes by Iran's ballistic missile and cruise missile forces against targets that would otherwise be protected by the layered defense architecture that Operation Eternal Dawn was specifically designed to destroy. The planning reflected a sophistication that Western analysts had consistently underestimated in Iranian military doctrine. The IRGC's aerospace planners had spent years studying Israeli air defense, its radar coverage patterns, its engagement geometries, its interceptor inventory levels, its command and control architecture, and most critically, its cognitive and computational limitations when faced with simultaneous, high-density threats from multiple axes. What they found was a system of extraordinary capability against the threat profiles it was designed to face, an extraordinary vulnerability against the threat profile the CH-7 fleet represented. The launch sequence was choreographed with a precision that reflected Chinese operational advisory input at the planning level, an involvement that went beyond hardware delivery and entered the domain of doctrinal transfer. The 7 launch airfields were selected to create approach vectors that maximize the geometric complexity of Israel's defensive response. Aircraft from Tabriz approach from the northeast, routing through northern Iraq and Syrian airspace. Aircraft from Kermanshah approach from the east-northeast through central Iraq. Aircraft from Ilam and Mehran crossed the Iraqi border at low population density points where radar coverage had known gaps. Aircraft from Avaz and Dezful approached from the southeast, routing through Saudi airspace at altitudes that Saudi radar systems were not tasked to report to Israeli networks in real time. 7 approach vectors. 7 simultaneous streams of stealth aircraft, each stream timed to reach the Israeli border within a 4-minute window of the others, close enough to create simultaneous saturation of the defensive system, spread enough to prevent any single defensive sector from concentrating its full response capacity against a single threat axis. The target packages assigned to the 2000 aircraft were organized in 3 functional tiers. The first tier, approximately 400 aircraft, was assigned to Israel's radar and sensor infrastructure, the ELM, 2084 MMR radar installations, supporting Iron Dome batteries, the Green Pine radar arrays supporting Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, the airborne early warning aircraft, operating orbits over the Mediterranean and the Negev, and the command and control nodes that connected the individual defensive elements into a functioning integrated air defense system. Destroy the sensors and the command architecture first, and every subsequent defensive engagement becomes a blind man's response to threats he cannot see. The second tier, approximately 800 aircraft, was assigned to Israel's active defensive systems themselves: Iron Dome battery positions, David's Sling launcher sites, Arrow battery locations, and the F-35 I-Alert shelters at Nevatim and Tel Aviv air bases, where Israel's most capable intercept aircraft were positioned for immediate launch. Destroy the interceptors and their launchers. And the third wave arrives into an environment where no organized defensive response is possible. The third tier, approximately 800 aircraft, carried the strike payloads directed at command infrastructure, intelligence facilities, military headquarters, communications nodes, and the political leadership infrastructure in and around Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This was not the opening move of a limited escalation. This was the opening move of an operation designed to decapitate Israel's military command structure and eliminate its ability to organize and execute a coherent military response to what would follow. 31 minutes from detection to first impact, against 2000 stealth aircraft approaching from 7 simultaneous vectors, carrying target packages designed by planners who had spent 14 months studying exactly how to sequence the destruction of every system Israel would attempt to use in response. The clock was already running before the alarm sounded. The gap between understanding the CH-7 as a specifications document and understanding it as 2,000 simultaneous combat aircraft executing a coordinated strike is the gap between knowing that a tsunami is theoretically possible and standing on the shore watching the water recede. Let me close that gap. The CH-7's flying wing airframe, no tail, no vertical stabilizers, engine inlet buried in the upper fuselage centerline, exhaust suppressed behind a shaped trailing edge, produces a radar cross-section that Western intelligence assessments place between 0.001 and 0.01 square meters across the frequency bands used by Israeli air defense radars. The ELM-2084 MMR radar that serves as the detection and fire control sensor for Iron Dome operates primarily in S-band, a frequency range at which the CH-7's RCS reduction is most effective. Against a conventional threat like the Shahed 136, the ELM-2084 achieves reliable detection at ranges exceeding 70 kilometers, providing Iron Dome's fire control system ample time to compute and intercept. Solution and Q, a Tamir missile engagement. Against the CH-7 at S-band, reliable detection range collapses to somewhere between 8 and 15 kilometers, depending on atmospheric conditions, aspect angle, and the aircraft's flight profile. 8 to 15 kilometers. At a closing speed of approximately 270 meters per second, the CH-7's cruise speed of Mach 0.85 at 14,000 meters altitude. In the terminal descent phase, that detection range translates to between 30 and 55 seconds of warning time before impact. 30 to 55 seconds. For a system whose engagement sequence, detection track, confirmation threat, classification, intercept authorization, missile launch, missile flyout, fuse arming detonation requires a minimum of 15 to 20 seconds under optimal conditions against a maneuvering target whose precise impact point cannot be confirmed until the terminal phase, with a radar that is simultaneously attempting to track not one CH-7, but hundreds of them, converging from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics of this engagement are not complicated. They are simply brutal. Each CH-7 inches, the activation carried one of 3 payload configurations, depending on its assigned target tier. Aircraft in the first tier, the sensor kill packages carried a combination of anti-radiation missiles designed to home on radar emissions and precision-guided penetrating munitions for hardened radar installations that had been geolocated during the 14-month planning phase. The anti-radiation missiles were launched at standoff range 40 to 60 kilometers from the target, meaning that radar installations faced incoming anti-radiation missiles from stealth platforms that the radar could not reliably detect until the missiles were already inbound. Turn the radar off to avoid the anti-radiation missile, and you go blind. Leave it on and the missile kills it. That dilemma, the fundamental vulnerability of active radar systems against anti-radiation attack, has existed since Vietnam. The CH-7 delivers it at a scale and with a stealth launch platform that makes the traditional countermeasures, decoys, frequency agility, geographic dispersion, inadequate against simultaneous attack from 400 directions. Aircraft in the second tier, the interceptor kill packages carried precision-guided munitions with warhead configurations optimized for different target types. Iron Dome Tamir interceptor launchers, which are relatively thin-skinned and positioned in the open for rapid reloading, were assigned shaped charge penetrators capable of destroying both the launcher and the ready round magazine simultaneously. Aero, battery, radar, and fire control vehicles, which are hardened but not to the standard of purpose-built bunkers, were assigned 500 kilogram precision unitary warheads. F-35 I-alert shelters at Nevatim, reinforced concrete structures designed to protect aircraft from conventional indirect fire but not from direct precision strike, were assigned bunker-penetrating munitions with delayed fusing to ensure detonation inside the structure rather than on its surface. Aircraft in the third tier, the command kill packages carried the most operationally significant payloads of the entire activation. A subset of these aircraft, approximately 120 units, were configured with electromagnetic pulse devices, non-nuclear EMP warheads, capable of generating localized electromagnetic fields intense enough to destroy unshielded electronics across a radius of 500 to 800 meters per detonation. These aircraft were assigned to communications infrastructure data center facilities supporting military command networks and the mobile command vehicles that serve as the IDF's redundant command capability when fixed headquarters facilities are threatened. Destroy the fixed headquarters with penetrating munitions, destroy the mobile backup with EMP, destroy the communications infrastructure that connects both to subordinate commands, and do all three simultaneously in the same 90-second window using aircraft that the defending radar network detected with 30 to 55 seconds of warning time. The F-35I Adder, Israel's most capable counter to the CH-7 threat, was not idle during those 31 minutes. 4 aircraft on immediate alert at Nevatim were airborne within 6 minutes of the initial detection alert directed by AWACS controllers toward the northeastern approach corridor where the highest confidence tracks had been established. Each F-35I carries the AN/APG-81 AESA radar, the most capable airborne sensor Israel possesses against low observable targets, and in ideal conditions can detect and engage CH-7 class targets at ranges approaching 40 kilometers. In the chaotic sensor-saturated communications degraded environment of the actual engagement with Israeli radar networks already being attacked by anti-radiation missiles from the leading edge of the first-tier aircraft, with command network integrity deteriorating by the minute, and with 4 aircraft attempting to engage a threat stream that contained hundreds of simultaneous targets across a 60-degree frontal arc, the F-35 is achieved. Intercepts. Confirmed kills in the opening minutes of the engagement numbered in the dozens. Against 2,000, the Iron Dome batteries that remained operational after the initial anti-radiation missile strikes engaged targets as fast as their fire control systems could process them. Tamir missiles streaked upward across the darkened Israeli sky in numbers that witnesses described as a continuous curtain of exhaust plumes, more simultaneous launches than anyone present had ever seen in training or in previous operational engagements. The batteries fired until they ran dry. Some batteries exhausted their ready rounds in under 4 minutes. Reload teams worked at maximum speed. Some batteries were reloaded and fired again before the wave was over. The intercept tally compiled in the after-action assessment that would take weeks to complete was significant in absolute terms. In proportional terms, measured against 2,000 incoming aircraft, against 3 functional target tiers, against the specific high-value nodes that each tier was assigned to destroy, it was insufficient. Not because the Iron Dome operators failed, not because the F-35I pilots flew poorly, but because the system as designed, as resourced, and as positioned was not built for this. It was built for a threat environment that existed before the CH-7 arrived. It performed at the outer limit of its design capability, and the outer limit of its design capability was not enough. The White House Situation Room received the flash message at 9:19 p.m. Eastern Time. By 9:24 p.m., the National Security Advisor was on the phone with the Secretary of Defense. By 9:31 p.m., the President had been briefed. By 9:45 p.m., 26 minutes after the initial alert, 14 minutes before the first CH-7 impacts in Israel, an emergency session of the National Security Council was convening by secure video link from wherever its members happened to be at that hour. The discussion that followed was, by all accounts from participants who have since spoken with analysts, the most compressed and the most anguished high-level policy deliberation in American government since the morning of September 2001. The difference was that on September 11, American officials were reacting to an attack that had already happened. On this morning, this evening in Washington, they were watching an attack unfold in real time, with full awareness of what was coming, and with the acute consciousness that the window between awareness and impact was 14 minutes, and that no American military asset was positioned to close that gap. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group was in the eastern Mediterranean. Its air wing was at heightened alert. A-18 Super Hornets were launched within minutes of the NSC convening directed toward Israeli airspace at maximum power settings. Their flight time from launch to Israeli airspace was approximately 40 minutes. The attack would be over in 14. The most powerful carrier air wing in the world was going to arrive 30 minutes after the outcome had been determined. The Aegis cruisers and destroyers in the Ford strike group had their SPY, 1D radars in full active search mode and their SM-6 interceptors at launch readiness. Against CH-7s still over Iranian and Iraqi territory outside SM-6 engagement range, they could do nothing. Against the leading edge of the attack package as it crossed into Israeli airspace at the extreme edge of SM-6 range against stealth targets that the SPY-1D radar was straining to track, they fired. SM-6 missiles arced eastward from American launchers in the Mediterranean in a stream that in other circumstances would have been described as an extraordinary display of American firepower. In these circumstances, it was a meaningful contribution to an engagement that was already being lost. The deeper crisis playing out inside the Situation Room was not tactical, it was strategic. The question that consumed the NSC's deliberations beyond the immediate engagement, beyond the tactical response that was already too late to be decisive, was the question that had no answer prepared. What does the United States do now? China supplied the CH-7s. Russia had provided operational advisory support for the targeting architecture, drawing on the same technical relationships that had structured the Tornado-S transfer. North Korean ballistic missile technology was integrated into the follow-on strike packages that Iranian planners had prepared for the hours after the CH-7 activation created the defensive void it was designed to create. This was not an Iranian military operation in the traditional sense. This was the operational expression of the Russia, China, Iran, North Korea strategic convergence that American intelligence had been tracking and American policy had been failing to adequately counter for 3 years. Striking Iran in retaliation means striking a country whose air defenses have just been augmented by Russian S-400 systems and Chinese HQ-9B battery systems, whose performance envelopes overlap in ways specifically designed to complicate American strike planning. It means potentially killing Russian and Chinese technical personnel embedded in Iranian military facilities. It means triggering escalation pathways with 2 nuclear-armed powers simultaneously. In a political environment where American domestic consensus for major military engagement has never been weaker. Not striking means watching the follow-on ballistic missile salvo, the second phase of Operation Eternal Dawn, for which the CH-7 activation was specifically the preparatory strike, arrive against Israeli targets that no longer have functioning air defense coverage. There was no good option. There was no clean option. There was no option that did not carry consequences that American strategic planners had spent years hoping they would never have to confront in combination. The alert level was raised. Additional assets were ordered toward the theater. Diplomatic cables went out to Beijing and Moscow in language that stopped just short of ultimatum. And the President of the United States sat in front of a secure screen watching real-time strike imagery from a country that America had committed to defend, understanding with absolute clarity that commitment and capability are not the same thing, and that the gap between them on this morning, at this hour, had never been wider. There is a photograph taken during the 1973 Yom Kippur War that does not appear in most history books. It was taken on the southern bank of the Suez Canal on October 6th, the first day of the Egyptian crossing, when 3 divisions of the Egyptian Second Army breached the Bar-Lev line simultaneously, and Israeli commanders in the Sinai were reporting on open frequencies that their encoding equipment had no time to secure that the line was gone, that the tanks were through, that the road to Tel Aviv was open. That photograph is not famous, but the spirit it captures is the foundation on which every Israeli military doctrine, every air defense protocol, every intercept algorithm, and every alert procedure that operated on the morning of Operation Eternal Dawn was built. And it is the spirit that operated on that morning, when the algorithms reached their limits and the protocols ran out of options, and the human beings inside the system had to decide in real time what they were going to do with the minutes and seconds they had left. Understand what those minutes and seconds look like from inside the system. An Iron Dome battery commander in the Sharon coastal plain received her threat alert at 4:19 a.m., 8 minutes after the CH-7S launched, 23 minutes before the first impacts in her sector. By the time the alert reached her through a command network that was already degrading under anti-radiation missile attack on the radar nodes that fed it, her effective warning window was not 23 minutes. It was closer to 6. 6 minutes between receiving confirmed threat data and the arrival of the first inbound contacts at the edge of her battery's engagement envelope. In those 6 minutes, she ran her battery through a full readiness check, identified and reported 2 launcher malfunctions to her maintenance team, and ordered immediate field repair on both simultaneously coordinated sector deconfliction, with 2 adjacent batteries whose engagement zones overlapped. Hers and cued her fire control system against the track data that was arriving in fragments, partial, intermittent, confidence rated at levels that conventional engagement protocols would have flagged as insufficient for firing authorization. She fired anyway, because waiting for complete track data meant waiting until the targets were inside minimum intercept range. Because incomplete data at 30 kilometers gave her a better intercept probability than perfect data at 8. Because the protocol said wait, and her judgment said fire. And in that gap between protocol and judgment, she made the decision that her training, her experience, and her understanding of what was at stake had prepared her to make. Her battery fired its full magazine complement in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Confirmed intercepts 21 aircraft. Her battery was then struck by a second-tier CH-7 carrying a precision-penetrating munition assigned specifically to her launcher position, a position that had been geolocated during the 14-month planning phase and included in Iran's target package as a priority 2. Defensive suppression target. She survived. 3 members of her crew did not. Multiply that engagement, that specific combination of technical constraint, human judgment, maximum effort, and catastrophic cost across every Iron Dome battery, every David Sling launcher crew, every radar operator, every command center, watch officer, and every F-35I pilot who was airborne or scrambling to get airborne in the 31 minutes between detection and impact. That is the human texture of what happened on the morning of Operation Eternal Dawn. Not a system failing. Human beings operating a system that was being defeated, operating it at the absolute maximum of its design capacity, and then continuing to operate it past that maximum because the alternative was to stop. The 4 F-35I pilots, who were airborne before the attack reached Israeli airspace, flew into conditions that no mission brief had fully captured. Their ground-based radar support the sensor network that provides the situational awareness that makes modern air combat possible, was intermittent from the moment they crossed into operational airspace, degrading further with each anti-radiation missile impact on the radar installations, feeding their data links. They flew on their own sensors on the AN/APG-81 AESA radar built into their aircraft, which gave them genuine detection capability against CH-7, class targets at ranges approaching 40 kilometers under ideal conditions and considerably less under the electromagnetic noise and atmospheric conditions of the actual engagement. They did not fly in formation. Formation flying against distributed stealth targets in a target-rich environment wastes the one advantage a fighter pilot has over an autonomous drone: independent judgment, adaptive decision-making, the ability to recognize, exploit tactical opportunities that no algorithm has been programmed to see. They spread. Each pilot took his or her own sector, worked their own radar picture, selected their own engagement sequences, and fought their own piece of the battle with the weapons they had until the weapons were gone. The first pilot to expend his full missile complement returned to Nevatim at 4:38 a.m., while the base itself was under CH-7 attack. Runway, lights out, ground control, communications, intermittent to hardened shelters on the eastern side of the field burning. He landed on instrument approaches on a runway he could not see, clearly taxied to the nearest functional rearm point through smoke, and was back in the air 11 minutes later. The outcome of Operation Eternal Dawn, assessed against the tactical ledger of intercepted versus penetrating aircraft, of defended versus struck targets, of operational objectives, achieved versus denied, was a severe Israeli defensive defeat. That assessment is accurate, and it is necessary to state it clearly, because clarity about what happened is the precondition for any honest analysis of what must change. But the tactical ledger is not the only ledger on which this morning will be recorded. Israel has a population of approximately 10 million people. It has fought for its survival in every decade of its existence as a state. It was founded by people who had watched the consequences of having no state, no army, no capacity for self-defense, and no option but to depend on the goodwill of others, and who had learned at the highest possible cost exactly how much that goodwill was worth when the moment of extremity arrived. The institutional memory of that lesson is not stored in archives. It is transmitted in families, in schools, in military training, in the specific quality of seriousness with which Israeli society approaches the question of its own survival. That seriousness was present in the battery commander who fired on incomplete track data because waiting meant losing. It was present in the pilot who landed on a burning runway and was airborne again in 11 minutes. It was present in the radar operator who stayed at his console, transmitting track data to interceptor batteries, even as anti-radiation missiles closed on his installation. Because the data he was transmitting was saving lives in the seconds before it killed him. None of them stopped. Not one. And the Iran that planned Operation Eternal Dawn with 14 months of careful preparation with Chinese technical advisors and Russian targeting architecture and North Korean missile technology has made one calculation correctly and one calculation incorrectly. It has correctly calculated the limits of Israel's defensive technology. It has incorrectly calculated the limits of Israel's will. Those are not the same limit. They have never been the same limit. And the distance between them, the gap between what the system could absorb and what the people inside the system were willing to endure, is the space in which Israel's response will be conceived, planned, and eventually executed. Not if, when. In the hours and days following Operation Eternal Dawn, the world that had existed before 4:11 AM Iranian Standard Time began the process of coming to terms with the fact that it no longer existed. The activation of 2000 CH-7s against Israel was not the end of a crisis. It was the opening of a new strategic era, one defined by the demonstrated fact that a non-nuclear regional power, armed with advanced technology transferred by two permanent members of the UN Security Council, could execute a strike of this scale and sophistication against a US allied state, while the United States watched from 30 minutes away and could not stop it. The implications radiated outward from that demonstration immediately and in every direction. In Riyadh, Saudi defense ministers convened an emergency session within hours of the attack. The question on the table was not whether the Abraham Accords framework had survived. It clearly had not in any operationally meaningful sense. The question was whether the American security guarantee that underpinned Gulf state defense planning was worth the paper it had never actually been written on. The answer the Saudis reached, and communicated quietly to Washington within 48 hours, was that Riyadh needed to have a different conversation with Beijing about regional security arrangements. That conversation had been hypothetical for years. It was no longer hypothetical. In Beijing, the foreign ministry issued a statement expressing concern about regional stability and calling for immediate ceasefire negotiations, a performance of neutrality so transparently cynical that its primary audience was not the international community, but the Chinese domestic public, for whom the government's role in arming the CH-7 fleet needed to remain invisible. Behind the statement, Chinese strategic planners were assessing the operational data from the engagement with intense professional interest. 2000 CH-7s had just performed against a world-class integrated air defense system under real combat conditions. The performance data flowing back to AVIC's engineering teams and to the PLA's operational planning staff was worth more than a decade of simulation. In Moscow, silence. The kind of silence that communicates satisfaction more clearly than any statement. In Washington, the process of reckoning had begun, the slow, painful institutional acknowledgement that 3 decades of assumptions about American deterrence, American alliance commitments, and American ability to shape outcomes in regions where its interests were engaged had collided with a reality that those assumptions could not contain. The reckoning was not yet complete. It would not be complete for years, but it had begun. And the beginning of it was visible in the faces of officials who had spent their careers inside a framework that the morning of Operation Eternal Dawn had permanently broken. The rules that governed arms transfers, alliance commitments, and the use of force in the post-Cold War era had not been revised. They had been abolished not by formal agreement, not by international negotiation, but by the unilateral decision of 3 great powers and 1 regional power, that those rules served interests other than their own, and that the costs of violating them had become lower than the costs of observing them. That is the world that Operation Eternal Dawn inaugurated. Not a world of more conflict necessarily, but a world in which the structures that previously constrained conflict have been demonstrated to be inadequate, and in which every actor capable of taking advantage of that demonstration is already calculating how to do so. We began this analysis at 4:11 in the morning Iranian Standard Time, with a 4-character encrypted message transmitted through a fiber optic cable buried 6 meters below the desert floor of Khuzestan province. With 2,000 engines beginning their startup sequences in darkness across 7 dispersed airfields, let me tell you what that moment was. It was the moment at which the strategic patience of a 45-year revolutionary project produced its most tangible military result. Iran did not acquire the CH-7s overnight. It did not develop the operational doctrine for their employment in a week. It did not build the targeting architecture, train the operators, harden the launch facilities, and plan the 14-month campaign in the margins of other priorities. It did all of this deliberately, systematically, and with the support of partners whose own strategic interests aligned precisely with making it succeed. The lesson of Operation Eternal Dawn is not that Israel failed. Israel's military performed at the limit of its design capability against a threat that exceeded that capability by design. The lesson is that deterrence, the architecture of threat and counter-threat that has governed great power behavior since 1945, does not fail gradually. It does not send clear warning signals in advance of its collapse. It holds and holds and holds, and then it does not hold. And the moment of failure is indistinguishable from the moment that everything that came before it becomes insufficient. We are living in that moment, not approaching it, not anticipating it, in it. The question that remains, the only question that matters now, is what the world's democracies, its alliances, its security institutions, and its political leaderships are prepared to do in response to a demonstration that has made the inadequacy of their current posture undeniable. History does not grade on a curve. It does not reward good intentions or well-funded programs that arrive too late. It records outcomes. And the outcome of this morning will be recorded, is already being recorded in the strategic assessments, the alliance conversations, the defense budget deliberations, and the quiet late-night calculations of every government on Earth that is asking the same question tonight. Are we next? I am Professor Jiang Xueqin. You have been watching the Jiang Report. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. Share this analysis with every person you know who needs to understand what has just changed and why the change is permanent. Because the world that existed before 4:11 AM Iranian Standard Time is not coming back. Stay clear-eyed, stay informed, and whatever comes next, and something will come next soon, stay ready.